Yeah, I was thinking myself about Coopetition and how to introduce the concept, and I realized that it may be new to some of you. It obviously is a contraction between cooperation and competition, but those two don't actually go together normally in people's minds. And I was thinking about that in terms of actually this conference, where it's been quite a genteel affair, very open and friendly, particularly to someone such as me who doesn't really work with FPSOs on a daily basis. And I was thinking about how these types of institutions contrast with the competitive dynamics of the FPSO industry. So I thought I'd introduce the idea of Coopetition with reference to a story about two friends who are out walking in the woods together, been friends forever. And what do? They come across a bear, and the bear looks at them and gets ready to charge. So one of the friends immediately sits down and takes off his boots and starts to lace on a pair of tennis shoes. And the other friend looks at him and he says, "What are you, crazy? You think you can run faster than a bear?" And the other guy looks at him and says, "No, but I can run faster than you." So that's sort of Coopetition. I think it draws attention to a few interesting things. There is this tension, if you will, between friendship and competition. There is this shift, which is sort of what makes the joke, between the moment of cooperation and the moment when competition takes over. But there's also this whole tension between what are the objectives and what are the rules, and at what point in time the rules change and shift, and what attention is given to changing the rules versus competing within a set of rules that are taken as given. And I do think all of these issues have really great relevance to the FPSO industry, given the pressure that it's under in this current business environment. But I want to talk about Coopetition from a slightly different angle, which is the relationship of FPSOs to FLNG. And I would argue that there is an emerging Coopetition relationship between FLNG and FPSOs, which is quite important to understand and to think about as you attempt to find a way to navigate through these very stormy waters that currently you're in. So Coopetition came from a book published some time ago. They did not coin the term Coopetition, but they certainly made it popular. It was a book to popularize game theory, really. And this slide sort of introduces the concept, and it has a picture of the two authors, Nailbuff and Brandenburger. And I got interested because I thought to myself, now what would it be like to jointly write a book about Coopetition, when you're not only writing about the concept, but at the same time you've got your co-author, and you're thinking to yourself, well, am I competing with this guy at this moment in time, or am I cooperating with him? And so I thought it was interesting to try and gauge the different personalities of the authors through the pictures and imagine what the writing of the book was about. But the thing is, and again, this is very, very clear throughout the course of the conference, people in a given situation, in a given industry, have a great deal of incentive to work together. And I think Puneet's presentation this morning made that point very graphically when he talked about issues related to safety and environmental concerns. If somebody else has a catastrophic incident in one of their FPSOs, it's going to be a huge blow to the entire industry, and everyone has a strong incentive to work together to prevent that from happening. Everyone would like to find a way collectively for the FPSO industry to emerge from the current situation and be stronger, to be able to compete under the current industry conditions, to be able to make the numbers work even under pessimistic scenarios for oil price recovery. But at the same time, a couple of other things are going on. First of all, there is this competition where if we're all facing a bear I'd like my company to be able to run a little bit faster than my competitor's company. But also beyond that, how can I change the rules of the industry? How can I make the entire industry morph and transform and evolve in new directions? So with that, in comes FLNG. And FLNG is sort of like FPSOs, but not quite. And I'll get into those differences in some detail in a minute. But what's happening is it's putting in a whole new cast of players, a whole new set of fundamental dilemmas, different rules, and all that is, in one sense, a challenge to your industry, but at the same time, it's potentially a source of real creativity and growth. So you have to think about it in both ways. So FLNG, you put an LNG plant on a hull and you park it in the water and you produce LNG with it and load it onto carriers and send it off to market. And all that sounds, in a way, quite similar to FPSOs, but there are some really important differences on the technical side, primarily because you're dealing with very stringent gas pretreatment qualifications, and you're dealing with cryogenics, which means you have to have specialized insulated tanks, and you have issues around cargo transfers that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. So that's on the technical side. On the commercial side, some really important differences as well. LNG, in terms of netbacks, is just not going to be as valuable as oil. It's consciously priced, even in the premium markets, at a discount to oil. The costs involved in liquefaction are very significant and need to be taken into account before you get back to the wellhead. So you're really trying to make it go with something that's intrinsically not as worthwhile as, not as valuable as oil. On top of that, you have lots more issues around markets. You don't really have anything approaching the worldwide market that oil has. And so therefore you have to work much harder to put in place a full value chain anchored by long-term contracts that are going to hold up and provide adequate pricing, usually through formulas that link it to some external reference, oil potentially as well, in order to get the whole project to get to the point where you can finance and go forward. Now, project financing is used, and some of the biggest project financings in history are LNG project financings, but getting project finance for floating LNG is particularly difficult, especially if you're talking some of these really huge projects like Shell's Prelude, which is in the order of $12.5 billion for the entire project, to the point where you can't really insure the thing, and to the point where the technology is viewed as commercially untested, and therefore banks are going to be very cautious about getting involved in it. So you do have these unique commercial challenges as well, which form an important contrast, I think, to FPSOs. So there is a finding, a suggestion, if you will, on my part. It's the first of a few, and that one is to be careful. Don't charge too quickly into FLNG, thinking that it's just like what you've been doing all along and know how to do well. You really need to make sure that you can handle the unique aspects, both technical and commercial, that make FLNG different from what you've worked with necessarily before. Now, the second area that I think is really interesting to think about is business models. And there is no set business model yet for floating LNG. And it's trying on a lot of clothes and seeing which suit fits best. And the suit may be different depending on the specifics of the situation. But really, you've already gone through 3 distinct stages and 3 different business models in floating LNG, and really the first unit has yet to come on stream. Floating LNG originally and this was very much in Shell's mind when it started out with the Prelude project, was seen as a way to monetize really remote and marginal fields. And it was very much within a paradigm of resource scarcity. The thought was, well, all the easy stuff has been accessed. We need to find a way to get smaller fields that are located way offshore to market. And floating LNG is the way that's going to open up that new horizon, that new frontier, and help the world deal with this issue of fewer and fewer resources as time goes by. Well, of course, the shale gas revolution happened, and that's made that concept, that business model, much more difficult to defend. But then there was a second business model that came to light and followed close on the heels of the original one, which was this idea of offshoring labor. And that emerged largely in the context of Australia. Poten, at one point in time, said that all Australia could do simultaneously is 2 or 3 LNG projects. It went way beyond that, but in a sense we were right, because it couldn't do that many without experiencing severe difficulties in terms of labor productivity and cost overruns and schedule delays, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So the idea came up, well, what happens if we can essentially build our plants outside of a place like Australia with all its labor issues, build it in the controlled environment of a shipyard? Can't we drive the costs down? Can't we make it come to market at a lower cost per ton of capacity with greater assurance of meeting schedule and budget? And won't that be a way to get out of this bind that we find ourselves in? Well, we'll talk about that in a bit, but I think that business model has some real questions associated with it as well. And then finally, there's this issue of a light footprint and new sponsors, which I suppose is the most recent one, and it's getting a lot of play. And the idea is that FLNG is a vehicle for, if you will, to break into the club of LNG sponsors worldwide. And new players can get involved and develop the projects, and they can do it in a way that's very easy and very well accepted by host governments in situations that have a lot of environmental restrictions, that perhaps are in a big hurry to get the facilities on stream, that don't want to spend a lot of time doing the detailed work around a specific onshore site. Ideas really that emerged from floating storage and regasification units from the floating import terminal side of the business, which has really taken off and grown around the issue of providing a simple, easy, and low footprint solutions to importing countries around the world. So FLNG is focusing on conditions and target fields that are similar to FPSOs but different. And that's what this scatter chart really tries to point out. The text on the right just points out that the markets are somewhat different and perhaps more diverse for the floating LNG projects that are under consideration. But at the same time, if you look at the chart, it plots water depth versus production size. And you can see the red dots are floating LNG projects and the blue dots are FPSOs. And there's this whole group of projects down toward the origin, down toward the zero at the bottom left of the chart, where floating LNG projects are not exclusively, but have a very strong focus. And this is an area where FPSOs simply are not present at all. So it's interesting, I think, to look at the tension between the market areas and say, well, what is it about FLNG that's drawing projects there, and to what extent that's different from what FPSOs are looking at, to what extent that they're simply going separate ways and not going to compete at all, or is there really an emerging competition to serve these types of niches and markets? Now, there is really a strong competition in the small and nearshore size. I'm talking perhaps units of 2 million tons per annum of annual capacity and smaller. And a lot of companies think that they can get into that space and play there, and if you will, leapfrog the traditional small group of LNG sponsors, primarily IOCs, that have made the LNG onshore business go worldwide basically since its inception. And what you see is companies like Golar and Exmar and Accelerate and HERG in particular moving into the mid-sized, small, nearshore areas. Now, what is special about Golar, Exmar, and Accelerate? Well, these companies started out providing LNG carriers, specialized ships to transport LNG. And then from there, they really moved into providing floating regasification terminals. And they've gotten a great deal of expertise in competing in that space and think that they can take both the technical and the commercial understanding that they've gleaned from the downstream side, from the delivery side of LNG, and apply that to FLNG. This is, I think, extremely ambitious undertaking because the capital requirements and the complexity and the issues, both commercial and technical, that I've outlined are daunting. These companies really tend to be much smaller in terms of capitalization than the major FPSO players. But there they are, and they do have bona fide projects here in Singapore. Golar is working with Keppel to convert first-generation LNG vessels into FLNG facilities. Exmar was heading to be the inaugural LNG project with a very small facility in Colombia that ran into, well, the lead sponsor there, who was going to lease the facility, ran into financial problems, which has thrown that project into some disarray. But they have numerous small projects between, say, 500,000 tons a year and 1 million tons a year underway. So they're making it happen. Arguably, they're experiencing real success. And I think that success contrasts really to what's going on with the major FPSO players. And on the right-hand side of the chart, it's obvious that the big guys in FPSO have thought about FLNG, and they spent some real time and effort developing concepts. They focused again on that mid-sized range, around 2 million tons a year. The engineering capabilities and business acumen are in many ways, unquestionable. But at the same time, they haven't nearly got the same traction. They don't have, that we're aware of anyway, immediate projects underway, or necessarily that close to being the favored solution for an FLNG opportunity. So you have to ask what's going on here. What is it about the business model and capabilities of these small people, and how can that be successfully internalized within the FPSO industry in order to perhaps open up this space, but certainly to be able to compete more successfully, even while growing the boundaries and adapting the industry as a whole to be more resilient to current conditions. That's at the level of the FPSO and FLNG leads, if you will. But then beyond that, there's the whole issue of EPC contractors and providers. And once again, you have a different set of companies. Not an entirely different set of companies, and sort of the Venn diagram presentation of the two overlapping circles is meant to emphasize that there is some overlap between the two. But some real differences as well. And that's an issue, I think, at this level of the industry that's well worth raising, which is to say, are there opportunities for EPC contractors in FPSOs to move more aggressively into the FLNG space? And conversely, will some of the FLNG players move more aggressively into the FPSO space? A whole second level of I suppose, combined cooperation and competition that could be unfolding as we speak, as everyone struggles with low oil prices and FLNGs and FPSOs alike move forward in their history in business. So the second finding is that the ostrich approach is not going to be particularly successful. My suggestion to you would be, you really need to think about floating LNG. Think about it deeply in terms of what's different about it, how it compares to your business model, how it compares to how you have defined your markets, how can you compete against the potential challenges and opportunities that it's going to throw your way. So clearly we're in tough times. I've shown, this is my now old hat, but I've shown how the Brent prices fell, rebounded slightly till about when the U.S. announced the agreement in principle with Iran, and then have drooped quite alarmingly since then. And I've put a narrative in the arrows at the lower right and summed it up by saying, look, there's not many FPSOs at Eagle Ford handling all that shale oil. Now, Poten's view is that you really can't reduce the explanation for the current oil price crash simply to the surge in shale oil from the United States, but clearly the abundant supply coming out of the U.S. and that miraculous turnaround there has had a big part to play in the role. So you're faced with an enormous game changer in terms of how are you going to deal with the shifting abundance of resources and the shifting focus for marginal production, and what does that mean in terms of your ability to survive and prosper in the long term. Now, that is a common challenge that FLNG is facing. I alluded to the evolving business models a few slides ago, but even before the first unit was on production, the initial business model for floating LNG was rendered largely irrelevant. So I think beyond this issue of having on your radar screen floating LNG and really analyzing that threat or that opportunity and what it means for you, there is this whole possibility of working together more broadly, if you will, to try to see off a common bear, which is the onshore shale oil threat. I think too, FPSOs and FLNG face common issues around cost overruns and cost and schedule control. As I say, I'm not an FPSO specialist, but researching for this, it's clear that cost overruns and schedule overruns and problems around delivering the numbers and the timing that you've set out for yourselves is a big issue. This goes through essentially the literature, but engineering scope, integration of hull and topsides, yard availability, all of these issues have sort of dogged performance in the FPSO industry over the past few years. Well, that sounds quite a bit like what's happened in LNG in the onshore space recently, particularly in Australia, because really the wave of new supply is coming out of Australia, and there's been a huge amount of activity there. But the performance has not been great historically, but it's really, really bad in onshore LNG right now. And I mean, we're talking historical levels of cost overruns. The Gorgon project that's shown on the graph there, that's now up to $60 billion. And some of these projects are on stream, but really the only one that's been on for a while is the Pluto project, which coincidentally or not is the most overexpended on a percentage basis of them all. And many of these projects still have a ways to go before they're on stream. As we speak, really, new cost overruns are emerging. Over the last day or so, I had to go back and revisit the slide pack and add in the cost overruns for the ICFES project there. What the ICFES sponsors did in a way was very smart, which was just before taking FID, they jacked up the price by 70% in terms of what they thought the cost of executing the project was going to be. So when they went in and took FID, they had just had a huge, if you will, cost adjustment. But in terms of measuring their performance against the numbers that they committed to at FID, they had a lot of headroom. Even so, they've just announced that they're going to be 10% over budget. It obviously is a possibility that there'll be more of a budget than that. Wheatstone, which is the sole project that does not have a reported cost overrun to date, just announced that they're nearly doubling the number of beds at the onshore work site, which I think can only be interpreted as a real push to try to throw extra resources at a project that has some issues in order to get it back on track and back on schedule. So it's possible that there'll be cost overruns in Wheatstone as well before the day is done. So the second business model about using FLNG as a means of controlling costs, as a means of beating this really pretty poor onshore performance that the LNG industry has had, I think can be called into serious question based on the results and performance that the FPSO industry has had. It's not intuitively obvious why attempting to put so much equipment in such a complex industrial process on a floating platform is going at the end of the day to result in lower costs and greater security around delivery on time and within budget. So I think there are quite a few opportunities to make a common cause between FLNG and FPSOs around these basic issues. I mean, we've talked a lot, and I've heard over the course of the last few days quite a bit of talk about how can we drive down our cost. And driving down your cost obviously is going to be an important part of responding to the industry environment. But beyond that, there's a more basic question, which is how can we be credible to ourselves? How can we make sure that when we say, yeah, we can do this project for this amount, it comes in for that amount and it's ready when it's supposed to be? So you've got this situation where FPSOs and FLNG could really work together productively to try to resolve some of these issues. But that gets back to this whole issue of cooperation versus competition. And to kind of highlight that idea, what I show in the chart on this slide is a more or less a conventional prisoner's dilemma type matrix, where if you're really, really desperate, you're the one who holds out the olive branch, and if the other guy feels stronger, he has an incentive to try to take advantage of your weakness. And conversely, if you're really strong and the other guy holds out an olive branch, you have an incentive to take advantage of him. The best results in terms of dealing with these basic issues of deliverability is going to be a collaborative approach that requires both of you sort of ignoring the incentives that you have to default and really making the type of commitments and long-term binding covenants that are going to give you credibility and really create a foundation for each of you to trust the other in this particular realm to confront some of the issues that face you both. So the third finding, despite the story that I opened up with about the two guys and the bears being faster than your neighbor in this environment, is not necessarily the best approach. The bear might get you both at the end. There are obviously many, many ways to begin to confront the joint issues that FLNG and FPSOs face, but I think it's worth thinking particularly about the stage gate process. And the stage gate process is something I think that in the last decade or so has really taken the industry by storm. It's been a very positive development in many ways. It illustrates the capability of the industry to adapt to new processes in a massive way that are designed to deal with some of the basic issues and shortcomings that we all face. But really, certainly from my view, in the FLNG industry, the stage gate approach has simply not delivered the results. I'm ex-Chevron, and of course Chevron is hugely into LNG right now. Chevron was the company really that started the stage gate revolution in many ways in the oil and gas industry, borrowing the concept from the military. But if you look at Gorgon that I've talked about, Wheatstone that I've mentioned, and Angola LNG, which I haven't, it's clear that you can't point to any specific empirical data saying that the stage gate process has delivered improvements. To the contrary, if anything, it's made things worse. So I would suggest that one starting place would be to begin, and if you talk stage gates, I think you will be talking the language of the IOCs. And again, just listening to the comments that are made over the last few days here, it does seem like there is a need to get on the same page and speak the same language to deal with some of these issues around bureaucracy and back and forth and standards. You can get on that page with them and begin to have a realistic discussion about how to take this good idea, which applies across FLNG and FPSOs, and turn it into something that actually delivers results in a way that it hasn't before. So by way of conclusions, just summing up the comments that I've made so far, FLNG doesn't play by your rules, but that may be a good thing at the end of the day. Be careful, look before you leap when you move into LNG, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't move. It just means you should have your eyes open. There are opportunities and threats posed by FLNG to the FPSO industry, and it's well to look at it in that holistic and open way and very carefully assess what those opportunities and threats mean for your company in particular. And there is this common ground to deal with these dilemmas that I've talked about around not just being able to compete under the current environment against the bear of shale oil, but being able to simply be very credible in putting across commitments for schedule and budget. So that's my perspective. I apologize again for not being an FPSO specialist, but I hope that this view from LNG and from floating LNG has been useful to you. Thank you.